Welcome. This is Deep Dive featuring Hudson Institute. And in today's edition, we will focus, of course, on the latest developments vis-a-vis the Lebanese theater, what's happening right now in Syria, particularly between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Turkish-backed Syrian or Free Syrian army, against the Bashar al-Assad forces, backed, of course, by Moscow and Tehran, alongside other theaters. What's happening in the Red Sea, where the Houthis, backed also by the Islamic Republic, have launched repeated attacks against U.S. both naval vessels as well as commercial vessels. But before all that, let's introduce our panelists for today. Starting from left, Dr. Mike Duran, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at Hudson Institute, formerly a Senior Director at the NSC for North Africa and the Middle East. In the middle, we have Dr. Jonathan Schechter, formerly the Chief Foreign Policy Advisor at the Israeli Prime Minister's Office, currently a Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute. And on the right is retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, formerly an Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. It's great to see you all. And I'd like to immediately start with you, Mike. What should we start with, since there is a whole long list of issues that we should tackle today?
Well, Jonathan, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and great to be here with our guests. The major issue, I think, in the Middle East today, and on the minds of everyone in Israel, is the events in Syria, where, as you mentioned, Turkish-backed forces have taken Aleppo. They're threatening Hama. They have shaken the regime to its core. And I think everyone in the Middle East is wondering, what does this mean? The possibilities are dizzying when you start to think about it. Of course, the immediate background to this move by the HTS was the effective defeat of Hezbollah by Israel in Lebanon. Hezbollah was crucial to the Russian-Iranian effort to stabilize the Assad regime and to defeat the opposition. The Turks have been trying for the last year to come to some kind of diplomatic agreement with Assad about how to resolve the war in terms that they could accept. Assad has rebuffed them. They now see an opportunity to put pressure on the regime, and it's not clear exactly what this means for Israel and other players in the region. Let me just give you one example before we turn to our colleagues here. The ceasefire in Lebanon depends on the Iranian and Russian support for the ceasefire. The Russians, the Israelis hoped would work to help the Israelis prevent Hezbollah from being resupplied and strengthened. When the Russians and the Iranians see what the power vacuum that Israel has created has done to their position in Syria, how are they going to respond? Are they going to work to build Hezbollah back up? Or are they going to work to try to stabilize the Lebanese front in some kind of tacit cooperation with the Israelis? You know, tenuous, cooperation is the wrong word, arrangement with the Israelis so that they can focus their attention on Syria and not worry about Lebanon. I think it's impossible to answer these questions right now. The big story here is the rise of Turkey. That the Turks have now positioned themselves as the single most influential power in Syria. Nothing will move forward in Syria without some kind of arrangement with them.
With that being said, wars are fluid, and therefore we need to see how those various developments, once the fog of war starts to dim a little bit, how they're going to evolve and where are we heading from here, since, of course, we do see plenty of Iranian proxies streaming or flooding towards the area of the battlefield in the area of Aleppo Governorate, particularly in the western rural areas of that city. And it is a strategic pivot for Turkey, of course, to establish really a new reality on the ground, something that it wasn't able to do for quite some time. But Dr. Schechter, I'd like to hear your take on this. On the one side, we're hearing IDF spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Agari coming out and saying to the Iranians, if you do transfer munitions towards Syria, we are going to intercept those. On the other hand, Israel is not very keen on getting embroiled in this whole facade, particularly when we're seeing, on the one hand, Turkey, on the other side, we're seeing the Russians, and then, of course, with the Iranians in the mix, it's better just to let them kill each other off, so to speak, as at least I hear, particularly when we're speaking about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, led by al-Julani, formerly the commander of Jabhat al-Nusra, and then second in command of the slain al-Qaeda leader, Adawahiri.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting confluence of events here. I think on the one hand, Israel has tried to make it clear that it will enforce the ceasefire and will act forcefully against any violations that it is identified. There have already been some reported incidents along those lines. There was also a report that Iran had tried to fly some munitions and weapons into to resupply Hezbollah, which Israel blocked and prevented from arriving. I think what's interesting, and building on what Mike said, is that there's clearly there are forces here in the region that see the blow that Hezbollah has taken and the blow that Iran has taken as an opportunity to take advantage of. On the other hand, because you're talking about Syria now, for the first time, you have a direct threat against Russian interests, and the Russians, invested quite a bit to protect those interests in the 2010s, specifically the port in Tartus and their access to the Mediterranean. And so I think it's a question now what Russia will do, given that Iran's and Hezbollah's losses are now affecting them more directly.
Indeed. Well, General Kimmel, I'd like to hear your take on this, since Russia was losing ground in Syria, particularly also with a lot of its officers and troops in the area of Aleppo being either captured or killed. And we're seeing also that it did not have enough planes to immediately react to this advance, being able to launch the first aerial sorties merely 4 days after the initial attack or onslaught by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the Turkish-backed opposition forces. What can you tell us about that, and to what degree is this a potentially detrimental position to be in, considering the advances that those Turkish-backed groups are making?
Well, certainly this is not good for the Assad regime. It hasn't had this kind of pressure for many, many years. There's been sort of this condominium around Idlib, a ceasefire, more or less. I will say, though, Occam's razor would say this is all being orchestrated by Turkey. However, there's still some gaps in that information that I'm not certain about. Number one, clearly, Turkey is denying any activity here. Number two, I don't see the Syrian National Army being involved. And if this really was an opportunity for Turkey to extend their influence, I think they would actually have the SNA involved in these operations, even though they're not aligned with HTS. Good military doctrine would have them working together, or at least in parallel, for common objectives. And third, the fact remains that the Russians are now back on their front feet. I'm not sure that Russia would necessarily want to risk a confrontation, or Turkey would necessarily want to risk a confrontation with Russia over all of this. So I'm still waiting to see direct evidence other than having a few Erdogan posters slapped up in Aleppo. One point that I think is quite interesting is how PMF groups such as Kataib Hezbollah are pouring in from Iraq. And quite candidly, I think that's a great opportunity for them to go over in Syria and give their lives for the Syrian cause. That'll just be less trouble inside of Iraq.
Right. That may make, of course, the Baghdad central government a lot happier there. But Dr. Duran, when we're talking about Kataib Hezbollah, the Liwa Zainibiyun, the Liwa Fatimiyun brigades, and all the different militia groups in the area of Al-Mayadin or Al-Bukamal in the crossing there, they have been struck overnight by the United States, no other, leading also the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, after traveling to Damascus, meeting with Bashar al-Assad there, and then from there traveling to Ankara for a meeting with Hakan Fidan, to say the following. According to the information we obtained, the terrorist organizations operating in Syria are in close relation and coordination with America and the Zionist regime. What are we to make out of that?
Well, I think that the strategic picture has been clarified by this event. I take Mark's admonition not to jump to conclusions about this all being planned in Ankara. We don't know that for a fact, but given the dependence of HTS on the Turks for basic supplies, economic livelihood, etc., or let's say the vulnerability to the Turks, I don't think they could have done this without a green light from Ankara. They may have decided to do it on their own, but if Ankara didn't want it to happen, I think it would be very hard for them to do it. And we have seen the Syrian National Army, that is the Turkish answer to the Russian Wagner group, takes a couple of positions focused on the PKK positions, YPG, in Idlib. So they're not completely dormant here. And what this clarifies the picture, I think, because from an American strategic point of view, as I see it, the United States has to decide, is it going to try to stabilize the region by working with Turkey, or is it going to stabilize the region by working with Russia and Iran? And for me personally, this the war in the Israel-Hezbollah war, or the front between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and followed by this event, shows us the weakness of what was the Obama-Biden attempt to create a kind of a high table in the region at which the Russians and the Iranians sat together with the Americans. We were not allies with them. We were not cooperating closely with them, but we were trying to get some kind of regional accommodation with them. I think it has fallen apart completely, and we have to go back to older notions of working with allies against enemies or against rivals. The Russian-Iranian alliance is a rival alliance. The Turks, the Israelis, they are our allies. There's friction between the Turks and the Israelis. The job of the United States is to minimize that friction, to be a kind of shock absorber between them. But we should be talking to Jerusalem and Ankara about how to push back against these guys, because we see what's happening. The Iranians are drawing on all the different elements of their alliance in order to shore up their position in Syria. This isn't in the American or the Israeli interest.
Indeed. Well, General Kimmett, you wanted to respond to that briefly before we move to the adjacent country, Lebanon. Go ahead.
Yeah, there were some reports out that the UAE and the United States were actually talking to Assad sub rosa, with the idea of using this as an opportunity of driving a wedge between Syria and Iran. I don't necessarily give this administration that level of diplomatic skill, but if that's true, that would be a good thing.
Indeed. Well, Dr. Schechter, I'd like to touch on Lebanon since France has been accusing Israel about breaching the outline of the ceasefire arrangement for the Lebanese theater, something that has been reinforced by the United States under the current administration in Washington. Nevertheless, Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar came out and released a statement in which he stressed that Israel is enforcing the ceasefire and it cannot just stand idly by while armed Hezbollah terror operatives are roaming down under the Litani River, which is in breach, as noted, of the outline. How can Israel operate within those different parameters at a time when the United States is expecting Israel to stand idly by and do nothing?
Well, I don't know if Israel's expected to stand idly by and do nothing. I think part of the problem is that it's the expectations aren't that black and white either. I see on the one hand quotes from the president who said that he expects Israel to to defend itself even under the terms of the ceasefire. On the other hand, you see these criticisms from both the French and I saw just in the last couple of hours from the American envoy Amos Hochstein. Along those same lines, the IDF, for its part, has said that they're enforcing the ceasefire, and the activity that they've done has been directed against violators of the ceasefire. They released some video of Hezbollah guys moving arms, and apparently there was some activity in and around a church yesterday. So I think for now it could be that these are the roles that everybody's going to play. The French are going to complain. Hezbollah is going to try and see what it can get away with, and Israel's going to respond. What's actually happening is of course hard to know.
Indeed. General Kimmett, your take on this. According to various reports, by the way, there is a lot of skepticism on whether or not this ceasefire is going to hold.
Well, look, there hasn't been a ceasefire in the last 50 years that hasn't seen numerous violations, not simply here, but anywhere in the world, anytime a ceasefire is imposed. I'm reminded of Casablanca ceasefire violations. I'm shocked. So I think we just need to understand this is part of the normal activities associated with ceasefires.
Dr. Duran?
Yes, I agree with that. I think there's a kind of inherent instability here in the on the Lebanese front. The ceasefire is not popular in Israel. The people of the north, who have been displaced from their homes, are not satisfied that the ceasefire represents a real security for them. They fear that once Israel withdraws from the immediate border area, that Hezbollah will return south of the Litani and will have their homes susceptible to direct fire from Lebanon. It looks to a lot of Israelis, including Israelis who were supporters of the Netanyahu government, as if this was imposed on Israel by the United States, by the Biden administration in the last months of the administration, and that there will be there's an expectation in many quarters that there'll be a renewal of the fighting once the Trump administration comes back in. Who knows? There are lots of examples like this in the past, as Mark suggested. I'm reminded of the war of attrition between Israel and Egypt. The same kind of feelings happened when the ceasefire began, but it lasted for 3 years before there was another big outburst between Egypt and Israel. These kind of uneasy standoffs can last a long time, but the volatility of the Syria front makes you wonder what the impact is going to be on Lebanon. And as I was trying to suggest before, I can argue it square around that it might lead the Iranians and and the Russians to do their best to satisfy the Israelis in Lebanon so that they can focus all of their activities in Syria. Or it might just be that they are so dependent on Hezbollah, the Russians and the Iranians, for ground troops in Syria that they have to start building it up again very quickly in ways that are going to alarm the Israelis.
There are reports, which I managed to confirm, of Hezbollah operatives, at least a large contingent thereof, that have been already deployed in Syria, not for the sake of attacking or defending from the current advance, but rather to defend installations belonging to Hezbollah along the borderlines, something, of course, that they seek to secure. But we don't have very much time left, and I still want to touch on two topics that are left. But before that, Dr. Shechter, when we're talking about the displaced Israelis, we're talking about 61,000 residents of the buffer zone, roughly 5 kilometers from the borderline with Lebanon, that have been asked from October 8th of 2023 to relocate elsewhere in Israel, and another roughly 20 to 30,000 Israelis who displaced out of their own volition, living in conditions, of course, that are very tough under constant rocket fire by this Iranian proxy from Lebanon. They do not feel a sense of security. What can the government, which promised them that at the end of the campaign in Lebanon they would receive that sense of security, would be able to do in order to revitalize that pledge and actually bring forth some sort of security architecture that would benefit their lives?
Well, I think the proof is going to be in the pudding, and I actually, building on what my two colleagues said about ceasefires, sort of the history of ceasefires and agreements more generally in the region is that they are struck either with Israel or with Western countries, and then they are constantly tested and more often than not violated. And you can go to the examples that were already mentioned, but you could even go to a more recent example, and you could look at the ceasefire in 2014 in Gaza, which is when at least one, if not both, of the IDF soldiers were killed and their bodies were taken by Hamas. That was during a UN-imposed ceasefire, and the list of agreements and ceasefires that have been violated and tested goes on. So I think for those residents in the north, they're looking right now to see how, by the way, all that is to say nothing of 1701, which has been nothing if not violated constantly and serially since 2006. So I think for those residents in the north, they're going to look and see what Hezbollah is doing, what Hezbollah is trying to do, what the IDF's response is going to be. I did notice, I think it was the commander of the IDF's Northern Command had mentioned something about rebuilding in the towns in the north that have suffered so much damage over the last year already in the coming weeks and months. But I'm sure that the residents more than anything else want to see what Hezbollah is going to try and what the IDF is going to do to ensure their safety before they go back.
Absolutely. Well, General Kimmett, the Iranian proxy Ansar Allah, which is dominated by the Houthi tribe in Yemen, has launched over the weekend a couple of projectiles in the direction of central Israel. These projectiles were successfully intercepted. Nevertheless, debris did fall in the vicinity of densely populated civilian areas in the next to the town of Bet Shemesh. All the while, in the Gulf of Aden, two American NAVCENT vessels, so U.S. Fifth Fleet vessels, accompanying three commercial American-owned and operated vessels transiting the strategic waterways there, have come under attack. Thankfully, this was pushed back, but nonetheless, the defense does raise questions as to U.S. resolve at a time when we're just before the transition of power in Washington. It seems like the Houthis are not deterred whatsoever.
Well, they certainly aren't deterred now. They may be deterred after January 20th if President Trump then brings in a new set of rules of engagement. If I could go back to that issue about ceasefires, one of the problems with ceasefires in the Middle East is there's never been a proper compliance and enforcement mechanism put into these operations. There has been no UN Chapter 5 operations, Article 5 operations like we had in Bosnia. That was an actual peace enforcement. But if you don't have a third party accepted by both belligerents that can get between the belligerents and actually not simply observe the peace, but enforce the peace, you're going to get these types of ceasefire violations and effectively a long-term solution that satisfies nobody.
We have less than a minute and 20 seconds. Dr. Duran, stage is yours.
So I really think the big question before us right now is the possibility of working with the Turks to stabilize the region. I see this movement in Syria as President Erdogan setting the stage for a grand negotiation with President Trump. The Russian-Iranian alliance is the key factor in the Ukraine war. It's the key factor in Syria. He's positioned himself in both theaters to be able to make the case to President Trump that Turkey is the key actor that can act to stabilize these areas. I find his argument compelling, and I think we should be thinking about the kind of arrangement that might actually bring stability to these areas.
Dr. Schechter, half a sentence.
I think that the big question about Turkey then will lead to Hamas, because the Hamas leadership has left Qatar and are reportedly in Turkey, which I think is going to raise some hard questions both in Jerusalem and in Washington.
Indeed. There was, of course, a meeting between the head of intelligence, Ibrahim Kalin, of Turkey, with the head of the Israeli security agency, Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, about this specific topic. We're, of course, waiting to see what came out of that meeting and whether or not it will translate into some sort of an arrangement for the release of the remaining hostages in Hamas captivity. But this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank General Kimmitt, Dr. Schechter, and Dr. Duran for all of your insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition of Deep Dive featuring Hudson Institute from here in Jerusalem, wishing you a good day. TV7 Israel invites you to watch and hear some of the most knowledgeable experts, most of whom partook in creating policies shaping this region today. Join us for Jerusalem Studio,